So this happened back when I was a senior in high school, and to this day, I still get chills thinking about it. It was spring break, and where I lived, winters could be brutal, so the idea of escaping to the beach for a little warmth and freedom sounded perfect. I didn't really plan anything, didn't tell my parents, didn't pack much, just hopped in a car with some friends, and off we went. This was back when cell phones were pretty much useless, unless you wanted to spend all your minutes talking, and texting wasn't even a thing yet. Looking back, I realize how reckless and stupid I was, but at the time, all I cared about was having a good time. 15 hours later, I found myself on the beach, exhausted and coming down from a high. I didn't have a place to stay, but I figured I'd track down some old friends I had lived with the previous summer. That summer had been wild. I had run away from home, worked in a restaurant under a fake name, and basically lived life with zero responsibilities. Not my proudest moment, but it was what it was. So I went to one of our usual hangout spots and started asking around if anyone had seen my friends. That's when this guy, Adam, steps up. He tells me he knows who I'm talking about and that they moved a few weeks ago. Says he can take me to them. Now, I probably should have been more cautious, but he seemed cool, and I was tired, buzzed, and just wanted a place to crash. So, I figured, why the hell not? We hung around for a bit, drinking and smoking while we waited for Adam's friends to show up. Eventually, a couple of his buddies rolled in, and we all piled into a truck to head to my friend's new place. On the way, one of them said they needed to stop for cigarettes and beer. At this point, I was feeling pretty relaxed, sitting right by the door, thinking these guys were all right. Once we had our drinks, we got back in the truck, and I ended up sitting in the middle this time. I had a good buzz going and thought everything was great. But after a few more minutes, I noticed something that set off a little alarm in my head. We were heading away from the city. No streetlights, no traffic, no people, just darkness. Then we turned into a construction site where they were building new condos. And then, a little deeper in, we pulled into what looked like an abandoned oil well. That's when my gut really started screaming at me. Before I could react, everyone started getting out of the truck. But before I could follow, someone yanked me out by my shirt. I barely had time to process what was happening before one of the guys swung the bottle of Goldschlager we'd been passing around, smashing it against my head. The glass shattered, and suddenly, I felt warm, sticky liquid running down my neck and back. It took me a second to realize it wasn't just the alcohol. I didn't stick around to figure out what was next. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I took off running. I had no idea where I was going, just away. One of them chased after me while the other two ran back to the truck. I ran as fast as I could, desperately looking for anything that resembled civilization. Finally, I spotted a porch light in the distance. That was my target. On one side of the road was a thick, dark forest, way too dense to run through. On the other side was a ditch leading to a creek, which was at least in the direction of that porch light. I was about to make a break for it when, bam! I was hit from behind, tackled hard into the dirt. One of the guys had jumped out of the truck and caught me. For a second I thought, this is it. This is how I die. They tore off my shoes, my hoodie, my pants, probably trying to make it harder for me to run, punched me a few more times for good measure. Then, just like that, they got back in the truck and sped off. I didn't move. I played dead, waiting, listening. The second I heard their engine fade into the distance, I rolled into the ditch and started crawling toward the creek. I had barely made it a few feet when I heard them coming back. I pressed myself into the dirt, barely breathing, hiding behind some brush near the water. They drove past, slowed down, then kept going. I waited a few minutes and started moving again. Then they came back. I hid again. They drove off. This happened several times, me inching my way toward that one distant porch light, them circling the area like they were hunting me. Every time they passed, I froze, heart pounding, convinced they'd see me. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I made it to the porch. I was barefoot, bleeding, covered in dirt, and shaking so badly I could barely stand. I knocked on the door, praying someone would answer. When the door finally opened, I nearly collapsed from relief. I don't remember much after that. I know the person let me in. I know the police were called. But after that, everything is a blur. I never saw Adam or his friends again. That was years ago, but I still think about that night sometimes. How easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't run fast enough. If they hadn't eventually given up. If I hadn't found that house. I don't know what they really intended to do to me, but I know it wouldn't have ended well. It still keeps me up at night. This happened when I was 16 during spring break. My mom and I decided to fly down to visit my brother at his college in a busy southern city. We'd spent almost every summer there, so I knew the place like the back of my hand. It was one of those cities that always had something going on. Bars, live music, people partying late into the night. A little chaotic, but nothing that ever felt dangerous. For this trip, we booked an Airbnb that had once been a classic Southern-style home, but had been renovated into separate rental units. The doors had been upgraded to sturdy metal ones with electronic keypads, which made us feel extra safe. The house itself had a bit of an eerie vibe. Old wooden floors that creaked, high ceilings that made every little sound echo, but nothing too weird. It was our second night there, and after a long day, we decided to call it a night around 10 p.m. As expected in a city like this, we could hear the distant sounds of drunk people laughing and shouting outside, along with guests coming in through the main entrance, which was right next to our room. At some point after my mom had already fallen asleep, I heard someone banging on the front door. Not just a casual knock. This was pounding, like someone was trying to break it down. I sat up, heart racing, but after a few seconds, I figured it was probably just some drunk guy who got separated from his friends. There was a wedding party staying in the unit above us, so I assumed it was one of their guests locked out. The banging continued for about 20 minutes, long enough to make me feel uneasy. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I let out a breath and tried to convince myself it was nothing. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but at exactly midnight, the banging started again. Only this time, it was louder. And whoever was outside wasn't just knocking anymore. They were slamming against the door with their full body weight. The entire house shook with each impact. Because of how old the house was, you could hear everything through the walls and floors, so I wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman from upstairs came down, probably thinking it was someone from the wedding party. I heard her voice through the door, firm but confused. "This isn't your apartment. If you don't have a code, you can't get in." That should have been enough to make a lost drunk person realize their mistake and move on, right? Nope. Instead, the banging got even more aggressive. The sound of it, flesh and bone hitting metal over and over again, made my skin crawl. It was desperate, angry. The woman warned them to leave or she'd call the cops. That must have worked, because after a few tense seconds, everything went quiet. At that point, I should have been able to relax, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I had been on edge all night, and now that the adrenaline had kicked in, my body wasn't ready to settle. I kept listening, waiting, half expecting to hear another round of pounding. And sure enough, around 1:30 a.m., it started again. This time, it wasn't just banging. It was slamming over and over, shaking the whole house. My mom, who had somehow managed to sleep through most of the previous incidents, sat up in bed, eyes wide. That's when she told me to call the police. I could barely hold my phone steady as I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm, which helped me feel a little less panicked, and they told me they had already received several calls from other guests in the house. Police were already in the area. I hung up, thinking help would be here any second, but before I could even put my phone down, we heard the sound of glass shattering, and then someone screaming. I felt like my whole body locked up. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Someone had broken in. Someone was inside the house. I called 911 again, my voice shaking as I told them the situation had escalated. I was terrified that at any moment, this person was going to burst through our door and do something awful. Then we heard it. Someone yelling, "Get out!" from the room across the hall. Seconds later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the windows. The police had arrived. My mom got up and peeked outside, while I stayed frozen in bed, too scared to move. When she came back, she told me what had happened. Apparently, the person causing all the chaos was an older man who was completely out of his mind, drunk. He had no idea where he was, just that he wanted to get inside. When no one would let him in, he got angry and started punching the glass window of the unit across from us, the same window that someone had been sleeping next to. That poor person had woken up to the sound of shattering glass right next to their head. The cops arrested the guy for disorderly conduct and property damage. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but that didn't change the fact that it was one of the scariest nights of my life. So back in 1991, I went down to Daytona Beach for spring break with 4 of my buddies. We were just a group of college guys looking to have a good time, so we booked the cheapest motel we could find right on the beach. It was pretty run down, but it had a decent location, and at that age, that's all that really mattered. The plan was simple: hang out during the day, go out at night, and just enjoy the whole spring break chaos. On our second night, we had everything mapped out: hit up a nice dinner, check out one of those flashy clubs on the main strip, and just have a classic wild night. But things did not go as planned. 3 of my friends had spent all day drinking on the beach without a care in the world, completely forgetting that the Florida sun doesn't mess around. By evening, they were sunburned to hell and so dehydrated that they had to go to a medical clinic. They ended up getting shots and were basically out cold for the rest of the night, leaving just me and my buddy Kurt. Neither of us wanted to waste the night, so we figured we'd still go out. We walked a mile or two to the main strip where all the action was and picked out a nightclub that looked promising. But after standing in line for way too long, we realized it wasn't worth the wait, so we settled for a more low-key place instead. The club itself was okay, not amazing, not terrible, just your standard spring break spot packed with drunk college kids. We grabbed a few drinks, hung out for a bit, but then Kurt started feeling weird. Maybe it was the leftover sun from earlier. Maybe the drinks weren't sitting right with him, but either way, he decided to call it a night and head back to the motel. I, on the other hand, wasn't ready to leave just yet. The club had a $20 cover charge, which, for a broke college kid, was a lot, so I figured I should at least get my money's worth. I stayed for a couple more hours, but as the place got more and more crowded, I started feeling over it. The night had been fun, but it was time to head back. By the time I stepped outside, the streets were noticeably quieter. The chaotic party vibe had died down, and there were fewer people around. As I walked along the main strip toward our motel, I spotted a group of guys up ahead. They looked like they were just hanging out at first, but the second they saw me, something changed. I watched as they quickly ducked into some bushes along the walkway, like they were hiding. Now, I wasn't born yesterday. People don't crouch in bushes for no reason. My heart started racing, and my brain went into overdrive trying to figure out my next move. I was completely alone, and these guys were obviously up to something. Maybe they were just messing around, or maybe they had a more serious plan. Either way, I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I hesitated for a second, trying to assess my options, and that's when I noticed one of them had already started moving closer to me. That was it for me. Without thinking twice, I bolted across the street as fast as I could toward a fancy-looking beachfront hotel. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran straight through the lobby doors like I belonged there. Once inside, I tried to play it cool, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I scanned the room. There was a nightclub inside, a bar, tons of people around. Perfect. I blended into the crowd, keeping an eye on the entrance, but I didn't see any of those guys come in. Now the problem was, I still had to get back to my motel at some point, and there was no way I was walking that same route alone. For all I knew, those guys were still out there waiting. I stayed inside for a while, trying to think of a plan, when I noticed something. The hotel's bar had a patio area that led straight to the beach. That's when I got an idea. Instead of going back out the front way, I casually made my way to the patio, hopped over the short gate that separated the hotel from the beach, and walked along the shoreline instead. The moonlight was enough to guide me, and the sound of the waves was a whole lot better than the paranoia of walking past who knows what on the main strip. I stuck to the sand the entire way, finally reaching our rundown motel without a problem. After that, I never went anywhere alone for the rest of the trip. Let me tell you about this crazy experience I had during my junior year of high school. It was spring break, and a few friends and I decided to take a little road trip to a supposedly haunted state park called Mossy Glen Hollow in northeastern Iowa. We were all part of a small film club that had formed the summer before, and since it was always tough to get everyone together, we figured this was the perfect time to finally go out and shoot something cool. The group consisted of me and 3 other guys. I'll call them Jake, Bill, and Kyle. We loaded up 2 sedans, packed some camping gear, and hit the road, excited for a spooky but fun adventure. Things started to feel off about an hour and a half into the drive. Right after we passed the last big town, my phone lost signal, and our GPS randomly rerouted us. Since none of us actually knew where we were going, we just went along with it. Soon enough, the paved highway turned into a gravel road, then into a dirt road, then into one of those barely maintained back roads that looked like no one had driven on it in years. That's when we saw an old farmhouse with a big machine shed, completely dark and abandoned looking. Weird enough on its own, but then the road ahead just ended. It dissolved into a mess of deep, frozen tractor ruts, making it impossible to drive any farther. We had no choice but to stop, unpack our gear, and hike the rest of the way down the trail. At first, Mossy Glen seemed like an amazing spot. There were these cool limestone cliffs, a scenic footpath, and a pond surrounded by trees. It was eerily quiet, but we brushed it off. Then we noticed a fence with a private property keep out sign, which wasn't something you'd expect in a state park. But whatever, we just made sure to set up camp on the public side. As it got later, we decided to grab dinner in the nearest town, a tiny place called Edgewood. It was smaller than we expected, barely 900 people, and we got a lot of weird looks when we walked into the diner. When Kyle asked some locals about Mossy Glen, nobody had ever heard of it. We thought that was strange, but we chalked it up to it being some lesser-known area and headed back to the campsite. Now, this is where things started to get really weird. We went exploring near a small waterfall, and that's when we found the fire pit. It had a long wooden log set up like a bench and a ring of stones with charred wood inside. The fire had been lit recently, too recently. Then Kyle spotted something else, a bright orange beanie, a single gardening glove, an empty beer can, and a stick of deodorant, all neatly placed on a large rock. The beer still had fresh foam inside. That meant someone had been here earlier that day. And then Jake found a cave. He shouted back to us, saying it was big enough for a person to sleep inside, and even creepier, there was some red fabric inside. Before he could investigate further, Kyle called us over in a hushed voice. "Shampoo," he whispered, pointing at a bottle of Suave shampoo lying in the mud near the creek. It was just sitting there, completely untouched by the recent rain. That's when everything clicked. Whoever had been using that campsite hadn't been gone for long. The rain had come through the night before, so if those items weren't disturbed, They had to have been placed there sometime after the storm. Someone had camped out there, in freezing temperatures, using the creek to bathe. And if it wasn't the people from the farmhouse, then who was it? That's when we heard it. Something big shifted up on the limestone ridge above us. Something, or someone, was up there, and they didn't want Jake looking inside that cave. The sound sent a shock of adrenaline through us. We all froze, staring up at the ridge, trying to see through the trees. Then we heard another rustle, this time closer. Whatever was up there was moving toward us. That was all the motivation we needed. We bolted. We ran up the dirt path, across the field, and back to our cars without stopping. None of us spoke until we were back on the road, heading toward Edgewood. We were still trying to process what had just happened. Could it have been a deer? Maybe. But a deer wouldn't have left fresh beer cans and deodorant at a campsite, nor would it have been lurking above us, watching. Kyle found a report online about an escaped convict from a nearby prison a few weeks prior. He was convinced we had stumbled upon his hideout. None of us were sure what to believe, but to be safe, we sent in an anonymous tip to the police about the strange stuff we found. We never followed up on it, and honestly, I doubt anything came of it. The strangest part? When I looked back at the GPS, I realized it had sent us the wrong way. We had ended up at an old abandoned entrance to the park, a section that wasn't used anymore. The real entrance was 2 miles north, but thanks to outdated map records, we had wandered straight into a place where no one was supposed to be. To this day, I still don't know who or what was up on that ridge. All I know is that we were not alone in those woods.